In Legends, Tatooine's desert is not natural. It is a crime scene buried under sand. Everyone remembers the planet for its dunes, but the sand is not what makes Tatooine terrifying. Long before smugglers hid in Mos Eisley, long before Jabba ruled from a stolen monastery, and long before Luke Skywalker stared at the twin suns from a moisture farm, Tatooine was not remembered as a dead world of dunes and bone-dry settlements. In Legends, it was a world of oceans, cities, shorelines, and a civilization old enough to be erased so completely that most of the galaxy forgot it had ever existed. Then the oceans were burned away, not by nature, but by an empire ancient enough to turn an entire planet into a punishment. What survived was not simply a desert, it was a scar so large that later generations mistook it for geography. Canon gives us the twin suns, the moisture farms, the crime lords, the Skywalkers, and Obi-Wan's exile. Legends goes deeper into the Rakata, the Kumumgah, the star map, and the ancient history hidden beneath the dunes. Together, they reveal why Tatooine has always felt too important to be only a backwater. From orbit, it looks empty. From the ground, it looks poor, hostile, and forgotten. Travelers see twin suns, moisture farms, cantinas, pod racing crowds, Jawas, Tuskens, smugglers, and endless dunes, then leave believing they have seen everything because the surface gives them such an easy answer. Powerful people glanced at it once and dismissed it, which meant criminals could rule it more effectively than any state ever had. Ignored worlds become blind spots, and Tatooine became one of the greatest blind spots in galactic history. In canon, that blind spot hid fugitives, criminals, and eventually the people who would reshape the galaxy. In Legends, it hid something even older, the remains of a destroyed civilization, the descendants of a planetary catastrophe, and Rakatan technology tied to one of the most dangerous weapons ever built. Before Tatooine reveals what is hidden beneath it, a newcomer stepping off a freighter ramp does not encounter silence first, but heat, dry enough to crack lips within minutes, intense enough to pull water from the body faster than fear can name the danger, and relentless enough to make the horizon itself feel hostile. By the second hour, an unprepared traveler is already weakening, and by nightfall, the temperature can fall sharply enough for the cold to finish what the daytime suns began. Tatooine orbits the binary stars Tatoo 1 and Tatoo 2, whose combined glare turns the surface into an exposed furnace. In the open desert, daytime heat can become lethal. Nights can drop with brutal speed, and the atmosphere holds so little moisture that survival depends on machines built to harvest traces of water from air that barely has any to give. On Tatooine, water stops being a comfort and becomes currency, which means every settlement, every household, every route, and every act of labor bends around the same fragile resource. Mos Eisley, Mos Espa, Anchorhead, and Bestine were not built to welcome the suns, but to resist them through low structures, shaded corridors, pale walls, and underground rooms where stone and shadow offer the only mercy the planet gives freely. Anyone who survives there long enough learns to move downward, away from glare and wind, toward the cooler spaces where life has a chance to last. Moisture farms are the legitimate economy because vaporators are the difference between a household and a grave. A good season can keep a family alive and leave enough surplus to trade, but a sandstorm, a raid, or a string of failed machines can turn a working farm into a countdown measured in days. Out beyond the settlements, the Dune Sea shifts over sinkholes, wreckage, and sarlacc pits, while crate dragons move through canyons and desert flats like ancient predators that never accepted civilization's claim over the land. The people outsiders feared most were shaped by that hostility more completely than anyone else. The galaxy has called the Tuskens savages, raiders, and sand people, but each name flattens them into a threat and erases the older truth that they are survivors before they're anything else. To settlers, they appear as masked figures on ridgelines, sudden violence in the dust, and warnings carved into the edge of claimed territory. To Tatooine itself, they're one of the few peoples who learn how to live with the planet instead of pretending it could be tamed. Their wrappings are not decoration, and their marks are not mystery for mystery's sake. Cloth, goggles, breathing filters, layered bindings, and seal coverings are survival against twin sun glare, wind-blown grit, and air too dry to trust. Even the refusal to expose the face belongs to that same logic, because a mask on Tatooine is a boundary between the body and a planet that is always trying to enter through the eyes, lungs, and skin. That memory is the part most outsiders never understood. In legends, Tusken oral histories preserve echoes of a world before the sand, of conquerors who came from the sky, and of a day when the oceans burned away. What settlers dismiss as hostility becomes something older and darker in that continuity, the inherited defense of a wounded world. The Jawas carry another piece of that wound in a different form. In canon, there are scavengers and traders who move through the desert and sand crawlers, stripping value from wreckage, broken droids, discarded machinery, and whatever the dunes have taken back from people who thought ownership meant permanence. In legends, their history goes deeper, linking them to the same ancient catastrophe that shaped the Tuskens. Their scavenging stops looking like a joke and starts looking like inheritance, a people-building society from whatever the ruin left behind. The Tuskens adapted to the open desert. The Jawas adapted to the caves, salvage, and machinery. In legends, both become living evidence that Tatooine's present was formed by something far worse than drought. Before the desert, there were the Kumumgah. They were not wanderers moving across dunes, because the dunes did not yet define the world. They were a civilization with settlements, culture, language, technology, and memory anchored to a planet covered by vast bodies of water. Their Tatooine had shorelines, civic life, trade, and geography that later generations would never see, because the world now mistaken for a natural wasteland was not born that way. The Rakata, builders of the Infinite Empire, found the Kumumgah civilization and folded Tatooine into their dominion. When the Kumumgah rebelled, the Rakata pushed the entire planet from orbit, using weapons powerful enough to vaporize oceans, ruin the climate, and transform a living world into a furnace of exposed stone and sand. This was not a slow drought or a natural collapse, but a sentence carried out on a planetary scale by an empire that treated a world as something that could be destroyed to make a point. Long before the Galactic Republic existed, someone on Tatooine could have stood near a shoreline and watched the horizon become steam. Cities lost the conditions that made them possible. Infrastructure failed beneath a sky that no longer belonged to the same world, and the survivors were left to inherit a planet whose geography had been murdered around them. Over generations, the descendants of the Kumumgah became something else in the eyes of outsiders, until the galaxy saw only masked nomads, robed scavengers, and sand. After that destruction, the desert was not empty territory. It was ancestral ground with the water torn out of it, and every settlement built over it, every claim staked into it, every machine sunk into it rested on top of a catastrophe the galaxy chose not to remember. Beneath the world they had broken, they built and buried evidence of why this desert mattered to them. Deep in the eastern Dune Sea, hidden under caves and buried passages, Tatooine held a star map, one of the ancient Rakatan artifacts that pointed towards the Starforge. The star map was not a public monument or a simple navigation device, but a preserved mechanism from an empire old enough to feel almost mythic, protected by the heat, dryness, and neglect of the same desert the Rakata helped create. The Starforge itself was not merely a factory. In legends, it was a colossal weapon-making station tied to the dark side of the Force, capable of producing fleets and armaments at a scale that could feed conquest without end. The Rakata considered this world important enough to mark with technology connected to their most dangerous creation, and the desert they created became the desert that hid the evidence. Their punishment covered their footprint, their ruin became their vault, and by the time the galaxy dismissed Tatooine as a wasteland, the desert had become its luck. For thousands of years, the star map remained under the sand while Republic officials, Imperial scouts, moisture farmers, smugglers, settlers, and criminals moved across the surface with no idea that a key to an ancient superweapon lay beneath one of the most overlooked planets in the galaxy. The star map is the clearest surviving sign from that legend's history, But it is not the only suggestion that Tatooine's buried past runs deeper than its modern settlements. Old ruins, anomalous formations, and remnants from eras no modern authorities seriously studied remain scattered across the planet, some perhaps Rakatan, some perhaps Kumumgah, and some belonging to chapters of Tatooine's past erased so completely that even their names are gone. It does not only cover bones and machines, but covers meaning until the record itself becomes unreadable, turning cities into ridges, temples into caves, weapons into rumors, and entire civilizations into things later travelers mistake for weathered rock. On Tatooine, the people with official titles were rarely the ones who controlled the planet's real machinery. Power belonged to whoever controlled debt, water, roots, labor, weapons, and fear, which made the planet useful to anyone who understood that a neglected world can be more valuable than a conquered one. The Republic's absence left space. The Empire's indifference widened it, and into that space came corporations, syndicates, and crime lords who treated Tatooine's isolation as permission. Chirka belongs to the older Legends layer of that exploitation, a corporate power that treated Tusken resistance as an obstacle rather than the defense of ancestral ground. Later, in the more familiar era, the Hutts turned the same lawless geography into a throne. Jabba did not need a government office because his palace, guards, debts, punishments, and favors became government enough. His authority was not written into law, but into the behavior of everyone who lowered their voice when his name entered a room. His palace had once been a monastery, which makes its later purpose feel like part of Tatooine's curse. A palace built for devotion became a monument to appetite, with petitioners entering beneath heavy stone and dim light while the rancor pit waited below the floor. The bones of previous failures did more than decorate the chamber. They explained the rules of power on Tatooine without anyone needing to speak them aloud. Mos Espa's pod racing crowds, Mos Eisley's cantinas, the spice routes, the backroom bargains, and the quiet exchange of people and parts all belonged to the same ecosystem. Pod racing looked like entertainment from the stands, but beneath the engine scream and cheering crowds moved debts, wagers, favors, and messages no court would ever see. Nothing needed to look organized from orbit, because on the ground, everyone knew who collected, who punished, who protected, and who could make a person disappear into the sand without paperwork. For servitude was the darkest part of that order, because it was not hidden in caves or buried ruins. It existed in the open, woven into markets, homes, farms, racing economies, palace compounds, and private ownership with a cruelty that had become ordinary through repetition. Bound laborers were controlled not only by threat, debt, and violence, but by devices implanted beneath the skin, making escape more dangerous and turning the thought of freedom into something another person could punish with the press of a trigger. Anakin Skywalker and his mother Shmi became the most widely known people held in bondage on Tatooine, not because their experience was unique, but because it was, in all essential details, completely ordinary. Shmi raised the most Force-sensitive child ever recorded in a Mos Espa slave quarter, while the Republic that claimed moral authority over the galaxy remained too distant to know her name. When Anakin left, she stayed behind, and the desert kept the part of the story the Jedi did not carry with them. The boy became prophecy to the Order, while the mother remained what Tatooine had made her in the eyes of the galaxy, a woman whose suffering could disappear because the world around her had already been dismissed. In Legends, the Rakata came and left a ruined climate. Chirka came and left scars on the people who already lived there. The Hutts came and built power out of fear and bondage. Later, the Pikes treated Tatooine as one useful piece of a wider spice network rather than the center of their entire empire. Every age of Tatooine's history shows the same progression, in which outsiders arrive because the planet seems too remote to be watched, take what they can, and leave the consequences to be buried with everything else. Tatooine had already hidden ruins, survivors, criminals, and the evidence of a murdered ocean, but the deepest layer was not only historical, it reached into the spiritual imagination of the Star Wars galaxy. History kept returning to Tatooine long after the galaxy stopped looking at it. In Legends, ancient Rakatan technology slept beneath its dunes. and the descendants of a destroyed civilization carried memories of oceans through masks and salvage routes. In canon, a slave child born there became the chosen one. His son was hidden there, and the Jedi Master who trained him vanished there for nearly 20 years, while the Empire hunted survivors across the galaxy. Anakin Skywalker should have been impossible to miss. His midichlorian count was unprecedented. His birth had no recorded father, and his power exceeded anything the Jedi Order had measured. Yet he grew up in a slave quarter on Tatooine, surrounded by dust, junk, market noise, and people too poor to attract institutional attention. Luke Skywalker survived for the same reason. A powerful child, hidden on a monitored core world, would have disturbed the surface of too many systems, but on Tatooine, he became another farm boy on another moisture farm under the same twin suns that had hidden everything else. Obi-Wan Kenobi's exile worked because the planet was not quiet in a peaceful way. It was quiet in the way abandoned places are quiet, filled with noise that nobody important bothers to interpret. The Force does not always gather around temples, capitals, or battlefields that announce themselves to history. Sometimes, the most important events happen where trauma, secrecy, survival, and neglect overlap so completely that the galaxy mistakes significance for emptiness. On Tatooine, prophecy did not arrive surrounded by marble halls or Jedi archives, but through a junk shop, a slave quarter, a desert hut, and a farm where the horizon looked endless enough to hide destiny in plain sight. By the end, the image of the planet changes completely. The surface still says desert, but beneath that surface is a world whose hostility kept outsiders away, whose native peoples carry memories of survival, whose legend's history preserves Rakata machinery tied to an ancient superweapon, whose criminal powers thrived because neglect became protection, and whose repeated connection to the Skywalkers and Obi-Wan made it one of the most consequential backwaters in the galaxy. Tatooine was never empty, it was covered. The dunes were not the absence of history, but the evidence that history had been buried deep enough for the galaxy to mistake a wound for a wasteland. Tatooine was not the only world the galaxy chose to forget. The Jawas carry a history far darker than salvage, and there is a planet so disturbing even Yoda refused to set foot in it. Both are on the channel.